open to Daniel chapter 7. Last week, we finished the narrative section of Daniel. The first half of the book is just a series of stories throughout Daniel's life in the Babylonian captivity. Chapters 7 through 12, the rest of the book, are all prophecy. And specifically, they belong to a genre that is called apocalyptic literature. Apocalypse coming from the Greek word that means to reveal. Normally we think of like zombies and nuclear explosions, but when it comes to biblical literature, apocalyptic literature specifically refers to dealing with God's judgment in the end times. But it does so using symbols and imagery. And because of that, apocalyptic literature is some of the hardest literature to try to interpret. So the most famous piece of apocalyptic literature would be the book of Revelation. And I would argue that you cannot properly understand Revelation unless you first understand Daniel and some of the other Old Testament prophets, because John's Revelation is simply building off of what we're going to see here in the rest of Daniel. And so it's important to remember when we're trying to interpret this weird symbolic imagery is that the symbols represent something. But it's very easy to fall into one of two ditches. Remember, we want to stay right down the center of the road. On one end, there's people that want to over-spiritualize everything to the point where these symbols are not connected to anything in reality and just become these like weird vague truths that are true of just about everything. On the other end, there's people that want to get like hyper literal about these and either fail to realize that this is imagery at all or try to correlate every single detail of these visions to our like today, like current events and what we see in the news today. We want to avoid both traps. And we want to really focus on what is actually trying to be conveyed using this symbolic imagery. And so you'll see what I mean when we get into it. Daniel chapter 7 is kind of split up into two different parts. So the whole chapter contains one vision that Daniel sees. And so verses 1 through 14 record the bulk of that vision. And then 15 through 25, Daniel turns to someone within this vision, presumably an angel, and he asks for help interpreting. He's like, what does this vision mean? And then the angel gives him the explanation. For the sake of time, we're just going to focus on the first half today, and then we will look at the second half, parts of the second half as they become relevant to help us interpret the first half. So, Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his head as he lay in bed, and he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. So everything before has been Daniel interpreting other people's dreams. The rest of the book is going to be visions that God gave directly to Daniel. And so we have a date for this. It's the first year of King Belshazzar. That would place this right before, somewhere between chapters 4 and 5. So we are no longer going in chronological order throughout the book. Chapters 1 through 6 are a series of stories that take place in chronological order. Chapters 7 through 12 are specific visions that Daniel had during that time. And so this first one takes place in the first year of King Belshazzar. Belshazzar, we saw the very end of Belshazzar's reign in chapter 5, right? And so this is going to be somewhere between chapters 4 and 5. Specifically, this is going to take place in the year 553 BC. Verse 2, Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. The great sea would refer to the Mediterranean. This language of the four winds of heaven is used several different times throughout the Bible, always referring to God's judgment. Jesus uses the same language to predict his second coming in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, and it's also used in Revelation, right? So the idea of it stirring up the great sea is it's communicating this picture of turmoil and chaos on the earth. In verse 3, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. Right? So out of the chaos of this sea emerges 4 beasts. These disgusting, terrifying monsters are coming out of the sea. Now, when we turn to the second half of Daniel 7, Daniel asks, is like, what does all of this mean? And the angel, or who we presume is an angel, in verse 17 says, these 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. So each beast is going to represent a king, or kings should be interpreted not just as individuals, but as their kingdoms or empires. Now, does that sound familiar? Right? We've already covered all of this. Right? 4 kingdoms is exactly the interpretation that Daniel gave Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. If you remember that, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of this image made up of various precious metals, right? So we had the head of gold and the arms and chest of silver, the body of brass and the legs of iron. And in that dream, Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar that each layer of this image that Nebuchadnezzar saw represented different kingdoms or empires that were going to arise in the future, at least future from Daniel's standpoint. And so what we see here is that these are saying the same exact thing. Chapters 2 and 7 actually run parallel with each other. There's actually a whole structure to Daniel that we haven't gotten into for the sake of time. But Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 and Daniel's dream in chapter 7 they're 2 separate visions of the same thing. They're looking at it from different perspectives. And so we can use what we already know from chapter 2 to help us interpret chapter 7. But right off the bat, you'll notice the differences between these dreams, right? If each of these things are going to represent the same kingdoms, Nebuchadnezzar saw his statue made out of precious metals, which means that Nebuchadnezzar saw the splendor and the beauty and the glory of each of these different kingdoms. Daniel is not seeing precious metals. Daniel is seeing wild beasts. So to Daniel, these same kingdoms are representing the violence and the evil that these kingdoms bring about on earth. Same kingdoms, but from 2 very different perspectives. So, verse 4, we see the first beast. This is, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. And when I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. So the first beast that he sees come out of the sea is a lion with eagle's wings. When we go back to chapter 2, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that the head of the statue represented him in the Babylonian Empire. And we know from archaeological records that the kings of Babylon would often depict themselves as lions. But here we see the wings are plucked off of this lion, and it's made to stand up on 2 feet like a man and given the mind of a man. Well, this is in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, and Daniel had already seen the fulfillment of that prophecy by the time he received it. Because what this is talking about is the restoration of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. When Nebuchadnezzar, because of his pride, God literally made him lose his mind, and he crawled around on the ground eating grass like a wild animal for 7 years until he humbled himself before God, and then God restored his mind and his kingdom. And so this picture of this beast being transformed into a man shows that when this evil pagan king begins to worship the one true God, he becomes less beastly and more manlike because men are created to worship. Verse 5, It says, and behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So now we go from a lion with wings to a bear. Bears are even bigger and stronger than lions. And this lion it's already chewing on bones, and it's told to devour much flesh. Right? And so Daniel, shortly after receiving this, would get to see the fulfillment of this part of the prophecy as well, because this bear represents the same thing as the arms of bronze and silver, which is the Medo-Persian Empire, which was started by Cyrus the Great. Right? And Cyrus was able to conquer Babylon, and he placed Darius over top of, to be in charge of Babylon that Daniel served under. That's the whole point of Daniel chapter 6. Right, and that Cyrus was able to create an even greater and even stronger kingdom than Nebuchadnezzar had. Then in verse 6, we see, after this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Right, so this time, after we see a lion, and then a bear, and then a leopard. Now, lions and bears are known for their strength, but leopards are different, that not only do they hunt with their strength and their power, but also with their speed. And so we know from history that the Persian Empire was conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. In that not only was he able to create a much larger empire, the largest empire that anyone had ever built up until that point, but he did so with a speed that was completely unimaginable at the time. And that he conquered most of the known world by the time he was 33 years old when he died unexpectedly. He got sick returning from trying to conquer India. He made it that far over. Right? And that makes me like, Alexander the Great lived less than I have, and I've never conquered a single country. I don't know what's wrong with me. But this leopard has 4 heads and 4 wings, right? And so that represents that when Alexander the Great died unexpectedly, he had no heirs because he was too busy trying to conquer the world to have a family. And so his kingdom was divided amongst his 4 top generals, representing the 4 heads. Those generals are going to become more relevant when we get into the later chapters of Daniel. And if you've ever studied history and you get into the book of Maccabees, which is one of those books that came between the Old Testament and New Testament, it deals with a lot of that part of the history. But then we move to the 4th beast in verse 7. It says, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of these horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, in the mouth speaking great things. Right? So this 4th beast, we're not told what kind of animal this is. We're just told that it's terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. So it's like a super beast. And so when we compare this to the legs of iron of the vision in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had, and then we look back at history, this 4th beast is going to represent what will become the Roman Empire. And if you know anything about history, you know that the Roman Empire truly was different from anything that came before it. It was so much stronger and mightier and achieved more than any other empire could even come close to up until that point in history. Some of you may have heard the term Pax Romana, which is Latin for Roman peace, because when you kill all of your enemies, then you tend to have peace for a while. And that's exactly what the Roman Empire was able to accomplish. But Daniel, in the second half of Daniel's very curious about this last beast and everything that comes out of it. And so he asks, in verse 23, he's told this. He says, As for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. Pretty easy to see how that fits the description of the Roman Empire. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. And he shall speak words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And he shall think to change the times and the laws, and they shall be given, into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away and be consumed and destroyed to the end. So we have the Roman Empire, but then after the Roman Empire, this beast is going to have 10 horns. So this is going to correlate to what we saw in chapter 2, where there was the feet made of a mixture of iron and clay, right? So we got 10 toes, 10 horns. You can see the similarities there. And we talked about before how if the iron represents Rome, then the iron and clay must represent some kind of weakened and or revived kind of quasi-Roman empire that's going to come after that. And so we have there's going to be 10 horns that are going to come out of, 10 kings that are going to come out of the Roman Empire. Now, opinions on these 10 horns are all over the place, right? You ask 10 different scholars, you'll get 15 different answers. Some people believe that these have already taken place, just like the 4 beasts, and represent, right, different people groups or kingdoms that branched off of the Roman Empire. Some people believe that these are going to represent 10 nations that are going to exist during the end times concurrently. Personally, I'm of the opinion that if the first 4 beasts represent consecutive kingdoms that come one right after another, then I think that we should interpret these 10 horns in the same way, and that there's 10 different kingdoms or world powers that are going to exist throughout history, going from the fall of the Roman Empire up until the end times. But I'm not even going to begin to guess what those are going to represent. I could be perfectly wrong, right? That's certainly not an opinion I'm willing to die over. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I probably disagree with myself too. Right? So we've got these 10 nations, but then he focuses on this one little horn that comes up after the other 10, and it's going to devour 3 of the other horns. And look at specifically what he says in verse 25, right? He shall speak words against the Most High, right? That this little horn is going to say blasphemous, evil things against God. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High, meaning that he's going to persecute the church of Christ. And he shall think to change the times and the laws, right? That he's going to bring about massive amounts of reform and do things completely different from anybody before him. And they shall be given to him, or to his hand, for a time, times, and time and a half. Right? So the emphasis there should be given to him, which is a reminder here that all of these kingdoms only exist because God allows them to, and that they somehow are playing into God's plan. But so this time represents 1 year. Times, plural, is 2 more years. And then a half a time. So 1 plus 2 plus a half equals 3.5. And so this last kingdom, this last king, this little horn, is going to rule for 3.5 years. I promise I'm not just making that stuff up. This 3.5 years occurs later in Daniel as well as in Revelation, and there's more things that go into it as to why I would say that 3.5 years. But just take my word for it for now. But this little horn, we would most often today refer to with the title of Antichrist. Antichrist meaning against Christ, or another way to look at that is kind of a false Christ, a pseudo-Christ, like a knockoff version of Christ who's going to come at the end. I'm going to leave that right there. I'm not going to talk any more about that because this figure of the Antichrist is going to show up again in chapter 9. So we will talk more about him in another 2 weeks. But there's more important things to get through in this vision. Verse 9 says, "As I look, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire, and streams of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000s stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and books were opened." Daniel is given a glimpse at the throne room of God, very much like what we see in Ezekiel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 4. If you want to go look those up on your own time, we see very similar imagery. But look at how this situation is described. First of all, right, we see God being named the Ancient of Days, implying his eternality, that God is forever, which is in direct contrast of these beasts, which represent the rise and fall of kingdoms. Right, that earthly kingdoms are very short-lived. They have their season, and then they're gone, and the next one comes, and then the next one comes. But God lasts forever. He is the beginning and the end, always has been, always will be. And he's described as having clothes of, right, both his clothes and his hair are pure white, implying that he is going to reign with righteousness and purity. His throne is made up of fire and has wheels. So it's like a flaming throne mobile. You can compare that with the image that Ezekiel sees in chapter 1, where again, the throne room of God has wheels with wheels inside of wheels. And right, this incredible thing, right, trying to wrap our mind around, right, is he describing something that he doesn't have the words for, or is this just simply imagery that communicates the glory of God? I don't know. But it's quite incredible. But he's also not alone, right? Talking about 1,000 thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 before him. Talking about this innumerable amount of people standing before him, worshiping and praising him. This may be angels. This may be the saints. It may be both. I kind of lean towards both, right? That maybe will be part of this situation as well. But right, this countless number of people worshiping him. But then the last part says that the court sat in judgment and books were opened. There's another place in Scripture where we see God holding court, opening books. And that's what's known as the great white throne judgments in Revelation chapter 20. And I think what Daniel is seeing is the same thing that John records there in Revelation chapter 20. But in verse 11, it says, "I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking," right? These evil, blasphemous things. "And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." Right? So Daniel's seeing this vision, but while he's having this vision, it's like his attention is being pulled back and forth between these earthly, terrifying beasts and the majesty of the throne of God. And he keeps looking back and forth until he's looking at just how beautiful and how splendid God is. And then he looks back and he's like, oh, the beast is dead. That seems kind of anticlimactic. Don't we get like some awesome description about who's going to slay the beast and everything that's going to go down? And the answer is no. We're not. He just looks down and like, oh, it's dead. And I think that kind of anticlimactic nature to the fall of the beast is actually part of the point, in the fact that these beasts, these kingdoms, they only exist because God allows them to exist. And when God's purpose for them and his plan is done, their power is done. And so the beast is killed and it's thrown into the fires of hell. Just like that, done and over with. Then we get to the best part of the vision, starting in verse 13. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, in his kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. Right, so who is this Son of Man? If you think back to like Sunday school, when you're asked a question and you don't know what the answer is, and so you just yell out, Jesus! Well, in this case, you would be right? That Jesus is the Son of Man who came before the Ancient of Days. Now, most often we refer, when we talk about Jesus, we use the name Jesus Christ. But it's important to remember that Christ was not Jesus' last name. He wasn't born to marry Christ. Christ was a title that was given to Jesus. Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, which is the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew word Messiah, meaning the anointed one or the promised one. Right? And so we almost always refer to Jesus as Jesus Christ. But Jesus in the Gospels never uses that title of himself. Other people call him that title, and he receives that title. It is a true title for him. There's the great story, one of the climaxes of the Gospels is when Peter finally makes the declaration, and they're the first person out loud to say, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of God." But the term that Jesus most often uses of himself throughout his ministry was the Son of Man. Right, taken right from this passage. In the phrase Son of Man, in both Hebrew and Aramaic, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. This is actually the last chapter of Daniel that was written in Aramaic, and then it switches back to Hebrew. But they're like sister languages. They're very similar to each other. In both Hebrew and Aramaic, the word for man is Adam, or Adam, the same name as the first human. And so by using the term, the Son of Man, Jesus is drawing from this imagery that the New Testament uses about Jesus being the second Adam. Whereas Adam, the first man, was given dominion over the entire earth and was supposed to rule as a king and a priest over the earth, but then he failed, and through him, sin entered the entire world. And so Jesus, as the second Adam, as the Son of Man, did what the first Adam could not do. He lived the perfect life, and he took the sin that was brought into the world through the first Adam upon himself so that we could be forgiven and restored to the rightful place of where Adam was supposed to have been all along. And so there's this beautiful story in Matthew 26 when Jesus is arrested and he's being interrogated by the high priest as well as a lot of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. And so they're trying to get the answers out of him, and Jesus just isn't saying hardly anything at all. And they're like, "Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to them, "You have said so." It's a very typical Jesus answer. It's like, "I didn't say it. You said it. Those are your words, not mine." "But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." The night before Jesus was executed, and he was asked, "Are you the Christ?" And Jesus quoted this passage from the book of Daniel to say, "Yes, I am the anointed one. I am the Son of Man, of whom my Father in heaven has given authority to rule over all of creation, and that I am setting up a kingdom that will never fall and will last forever." That earthly kingdoms come and go. We've seen the rise of superpowers over and over and over again throughout history. And right now we're in America, and we are in the strongest nation the world has ever seen. And someday America will come to an end. But the kingdom of God will not end, and it will go on forever. So when it comes to trying to interpret passages like Daniel 7 or some of the other passages we're going to look at, or the book of Revelation, if you want to get out your maps and your timeline of history and you want to try to pinpoint every single detail of these and try to decipher the code and figure out what all of this means, knock your socks off. It's a lot of fun, very confusing, right? You will go down a lot of weird rabbit holes if you do that. But if you want to go down those rabbit holes, let me just give you some caution. First of all, we need to realize that you cannot interpret a 5th century BC Middle Eastern prophecy through your 21st century American lenses, right? Not everything's about us, right? Every people group since these things have been given thought that this was directly about them. It's probably not. A lot of people have been made to look very foolish because they thought they knew exactly how all this stuff was going to work out. But second, we need to read it through the lens of the person of who it was given in order to understand what's actually being communicated here. And that, put yourself in the shoes of Daniel. Daniel has spent his entire adult life living as an exile in a foreign land. And that all Daniel wants is to, if not himself, then at least his people to return home, to rebuild the temple, and just to go back to normal and just to worship their God and offer their sacrifices. That's all Daniel cares about. And Daniel's a really smart guy. He knows about the prophecies that Jeremiah gave about how the exile is going to last 70 years, and he's literally counting down the days until his people get to go home. And so Daniel is just crying out to God, right? God, when can I go home? And right, are things going to get better after this? And so during this tumultuous time, this terrible time that Daniel's going through, he's witnessing firsthand the evils of these pagan nations set on world domination, of multiple different kings that he's worked under, doing these terrible things and conquering all of these lands. And God gives him this vision that says, no, things are not going to get worse. That Daniel is currently living under the first beast. And then Daniel is going to get to see the rise of the second beast of Persia. And then after that is going to come a third and a fourth beast. And each kingdom that is going to come is going to become more violent and even worse than the one that came before it. And all 4 of these kingdoms are going to rule over God's people, the Israelites. And so the answer is things are not going to get better. They're only going to get worse because the sinfulness of man is just going to continue to consume the entire earth. But there will come a day when God will sit as the perfect, righteous judge, and that God will judge all of these nations, and everyone will have to give account for their sins before God, and that God will send the Son of Man. And what Daniel failed to realize at that time, that Son of Man was going to be God's Son, right? The second person of the Trinity, who is going to come, and he will establish his kingdom forever. And he will make everything right. He will judge every sin. He will judge the wicked. He will rescue the righteous. And that he will set up a kingdom that will never be defeated. And so things are going to have to get worse before they get better. And so we find ourselves 2,500 years after Daniel, really in the same situation. Right, we talked about in chapter 1 that this world is not our home, that we are exiles. We are foreigners trying to figure out how to worship our God first and then how to serve our country second. But knowing that there is something greater that will come after this, and that we will get to rule and reign with Christ for all of eternity. This time I'm going to ask the men if they'll come forward for communion, right? And so we get to take part in this beautiful picture